know this is a hypothetical and philosophical question, but in time it's going to turn into reality at some point. Would you rather pay more money to buy a video game, or would you rather see microtransactions be the prevalent way to pay for games? And no, option number 3 is not buying a dildo to the YouTube article. Fuck himself. So it's a simple hypothetical question. Would you rather pay a higher price to buy a game, like let's say $70 to $75, and have it come without an invasive microtransaction system? Or would you rather have games remain at the same price or cheaper, which we'll talk about later, but you flood the game with microtransactions to pay for the content? Because if history shows us anything, this is probably going to be the choice we're going to make when the next console generation comes around. Now, to illustrate my point, you have to look at history for a second so we can detail the pattern. Anyone old enough to remember the oldest video game consoles like Atari, Nintendo, know that with each generation of consoles, gaming prices usually have gone up. The cost of a game has almost always gone up anytime there was a new console generation. PlayStation 2 and Xbox games were $50. PlayStation 1, Sega Saturn, and N64 games were $40. Well, for the most part, because that generation of consoles was all over the place. Oh man, that shit was all over the place like a blind man spraying in an orgy. N64 initially charged $60 for their game. PlayStation 1 then came out and they charged $40 for their game. So Nintendo started dropping their prices to compete. Saturn wanted to be the premium console and they sold their shit for anywhere from $40 to $100 a game. So that generation was odd as fuck. Prior to that, we had Super Nintendo, and games were roughly $35 to $50, depending on whether or not the game had the extended cartridge or not. But the history of our consoles and games have shown that prices will go up at some point. And that some point always seemed to be the next generation of consoles, because they claimed the media player was different technology. We went from cartridges to CD-ROM to DVD to Blu-ray. So there was always the excuse, right? There was always something to point at and say, hey, this is the reason the price of games are going up. However, when Sony and Microsoft launched our current consoles, the game prices remained fixed at $60, which was a carryover from PlayStation 3 and 360. Some speculate that was because the media wasn't a huge enough upgrade. You know, going from Blu-ray to an upgraded version of Blu-ray, so they couldn't really justify the price increase. Others like to speculate that Sony planned on undercutting Microsoft on price when they launched the consoles. You know, the theory behind that was that Microsoft was going to launch their games at $70 on the new console. So when rumors floated around that that was the price, Sony decided they were going to try and stay cheaper and keep their prices at $60. You know, Microsoft was already on thin ice with the launch of Xbox One and all that fucking TV bullshit. So Microsoft had to stay at $60. We'll never know if that is the reason. We will never be able to prove whether or not that was the case. But we can only go by what other studios tell us, that $60 was the price point they were comfortable with. But the fact remains that console games have been the same price now ever since Xbox 360 launched in 2005. That's 14 years, and we're most likely going to be 15 plus years at the same price before the next generation of consoles are launched. Can we just take a minute to think about that for a second? I mean, really think about this. 15 years. Prices have not increased. Think about that. In that time, how much have movies gone up? How much have TV subscriptions gone up? You know, what does the internet cost now compared to what it does a few years ago? Netflix prices, or theme park tickets, Broadway tickets. Prices for entertainment always go up. That's just how society works. But for 15 years, we have paid the same price for our video games. Surely you know studios' costs are going to go up in those 15 years, whether it's the salary of your employees increases, the rent increases, your benefit costs go up, you need equipment, you always want new and better equipment. I mean, can you imagine making the same game on technology from 15 years ago? Well, aside if you're a Call of Duty developer at Bethesda. But imagine using the same computers now that you were using 15 years ago? Come on, man. We can debate about the cost of video games all we want, but what's not debatable is the overhead costs are going up for every studio all the time. Yet the price of the game and the price of the product has remained the same for 15 years. Because of that, enter microtransactions, or video games version of selling a puff of weed for $1 instead of buying a whole dime bag. Microtransactions are currently the additional source of income that publishers have been using not to make up the increase for gaming prices, not the studios. Publishers have been doing this. And let me clarify this for a second, because I know there's a lot of confusion in regards to DLC versus microtransactions. So for the rest of the video, I want to clear up any confusion. I view DLC and microtransactions as two different things, and I want to define them as two different things. To me, microtransactions are the smaller, cosmetic, in-game loot transactions that you buy. You know, things like a skin to a gun, costume for a character, you know, in-game currency that you buy, like game cosmetics or whatever the fuck you want. DLC stands for downloadable content. And microtransactions are downloadable content, but so we're not fucking splitting hairs here. I see DLC, and I define it in this video, as added playable content. A map to play on, a new gun or character, new story missions, campaign missions, or whatever the fuck. Some companies offer this for free, some offer it for money. Some use fucked up season passes where you pay one price and then you get fucked over in the amount of content they deliver. Whatever. From this point on, microtransactions refers to the smaller cosmetic shit that isn't paid to win, and DLC refers to playable content that isn't just a cosmetic skin or emote or some shit like that. Back when consoles were first learning the power of online gaming, and studios were learning that not only could they fix their games after launch, but they could roll out more DLC content. Before the internet became part of video games, right? Usually you would buy your game, and whether or not your game was great or in a shitty state, you were stuck with that state of the game. It wasn't going to get better. It wasn't going to get more content. But when you added online connectivity, then all of a sudden studios were able to not only fix the games, but add more content. And the thing is, it didn't start out as a cash grab. It was actually used to entice players to stay with the game. Some of the earliest games would roll out some content for them, like missions or stories or maps or weapons, whatever it was. It wasn't just cosmetic shit that we see nowadays. Although, the fucking horse armor from Bethesda, oh god, that was the earliest fucking cosmetic shit that pimped people out. That was just fucking horrendous. $2 for horse armor. And they called it DLC, not a microtransaction. They were like, oh, this is horse DLC. What a bunch of, I ain't gonna get into that shit, man. Not all DLC started out that horribly. I mean, it was meant to really extend the life of a game. But of course, anything that you do in goodwill can be exploited. And it can certainly be done by a greedy fucking company. Both Activision and EA really started some predatory shit over the next couple of years. And although Ubisoft and Take-Two had their own greedy fucking scams, it's not as bad as those two leading cunts. Giving us full-scale DLC drops with additional content for money is one thing, but the microtransactions that we see these days are a total different ballgame. I mean, they're using cut content as your DLC. That's pretty fucking low. In the cases of Assassin's Creed and Destiny, that shit was fucking horrible, man. Gamers right now are naturally fed up with all of this bullshit. From games like EA's Star Wars with the Battlefront loot boxes, you have Shadow of Mordor's microtransactions, Destiny's Eververse, Call of Duty's loot boxes, Bethesda of all fucking people. You know they're a bunch of assholes. What do? They take shit that their fans have made, turn around, and sell that shit as microtransactions. I mean, games are now being negatively reviewed simply for their microtransactions. Some games that were actually decently reviewed and fairly well received decided to fuck things up with horrible microtransactions after the fact. Think of Black Ops 4, the perfect example, which, by the way, is going to get its own video in the future. We're going to talk about Black Ops 4 in the coming weeks. But essentially, a game like that rolled out what was a fairly decent game, only to fuck it up down the road with their microtransactions. You know, the communities of gamers have all managed to raise their opinions loud enough to make some changes. Not all changes, but some changes to prevent some of these stupid fucking cash grab ideas. People got pissed off with Star Wars' loot boxes, so naturally EA had to pull on that shit back. Destiny had all those fucking events that were basically microtransactions through Eververse. So what do? They made it so that you can earn the content through gameplay. Studios, of course, will still have to sell their microtransactions, and they still have their DLC to sell, of course. And some of them are still going to be doing some underhanded shit, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the video, but you can see the writing on the wall. You can see changes coming in some form or another when it comes to the next generation of consoles. At some point, prices have to go up, one way or another. Gaming prices didn't go up for almost 15 years, so microtransactions were being used to fund that shit. But with the backlash that microtransactions have been receiving for being incredibly greedy, publishers are going to have to get their money somewhere, right? You can just see the proposition coming down in the future. EA and Activision, they're going to roll out all their surveys behind the scenes, get feedback from fucking halfway gamers. But the main question is going to be, as a consumer, as a video game player, Are you willing to pay more money for the next generation console games, or are you willing to let the games be funded more often with microtransactions? Knowing publishers, they're going to try and do both. Because they know they're a bunch of assholes. They're going to try and raise the cost of games and raise the frequency of microtransactions, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. One of the patterns that we've seen with games over the past 10 years, though, has been the incomplete games being sold and then fixed later. Earlier, I talked about how internet connectivity allows studios to come back and fix games, but what happens when they decide to sell a half-assed product and then sell you the other half later? Get something out on the market, no matter how complete or incomplete it is, make some money, and then you fix it afterwards. Particularly games that have sit in development hell, or games that have an extremely short deadline to the market. How often do you see a game being released in a shitty or shallow state with the promise that it's going to be fixed after they already have your money? Mass Effect Andromeda is certainly one game that did that. A game that was in developmental hell because it was given to a support studio that never made a full game before. Destiny will forever live in that realm, considering how rushed the first one felt and then how incomplete the second one feels. Fallout 76 released a horrendous piece of shit. But they wanted you to buy microtransactions in their broken fucking game. And of course, we have the all-time scam Star Citizen, which hasn't even fucking released. But they use microtransactions and fundraising to pay for their development. Selling $25,000 ships for a game that's basically a large-scale demo at this point. Let me think about that for a second. Some people have $25,000 to piss away on a digital spaceship to a game that's not even fucking released yet. That's incredible, man. And they keep getting these motherfuckers. Publishers get your money, and so does Star Citizen. Whether the studio fixes the game or not, they're always going to get your money. Andromeda was a game that pretty much held their players hostage. They released it in such a shitty state, they didn't sell well, and EA only dedicated minor resources to fixing it because it didn't sell well. Players saw right through that bullshit. You know, it's sort of like the mob offering you protection, but you have to pay to protect them from the people who would hurt you, namely them. So it's like, wait a second, I'm paying you for protection, but the only people that are going to hurt me are you. So basically, I'm paying you not to hurt me. Yeah, that's basically what the fuck is happening. Another byproduct of studio greed is cut content for the DLC that I already mentioned. You have a total vision of your game, right? You begin making it. And then you realize that if you cut out 20% of the final game, you can finish it faster, and afterwards, you can sell that 20% to people for money. That's like going to get a sandwich and you want to get a foot-long sandwich, right? Only for the store to cut off a portion of your sandwich and ask you, do you want to pay extra for the deluxe side version of your sandwich? Motherfucker, 8 inches is not a foot long. Give me the rest of my fucking sandwich, man. And yes, women will tell you size does matter. 8 inches and 12 inches is not the same. You know, I remember years ago, Assassin's Creed did that shit. Assassin's Creed 2 was a damn good game. It was a massive improvement above Assassin's Creed 1. But one of the funniest things about that game is that you can actually see the 2 chapters or sequences, as they like to call them. They were unavailable at launch. You see the fucking things in the game. But Ubisoft decided to hold these back for time constraints only to sell them later as DLC? Yep, they pioneered that shit well before Destiny did it with their first 3 DLC packs. So if you're looking at a company that really fucked people over, that's one to look at. These practices are already going on right now with $60 games. And regardless of what the pricing games go up to these days, these practices are always going to continue. It's not going to stop. Studios can tell you that $75 is going to fix all the issues with their games. Bullshit. Money doesn't fix these issues. We know that. Competent studios and management teams fix these issues. One of the biggest financial problems with video games these days, and this is going to come as no surprise to you, is the greed of publishers. The greed of publishers is what pushes studios into these shitty decisions. I won't get into too much detail because this topic deserves its own video, and maybe I'll do one down the road. But publishers have been setting some of the most unrealistic goal sales for studios in the past 5 years. I mean, part of that is greed, part of that is trying to keep investors happy with stock market growth and all that other shit. And the other part is that some dickhead in a suit thinks he knows what gamers want. The pressure a publisher puts on a studio to make money is unrealistic these days. Not every game is going to sell like Grand Theft Auto. Not every game is going to gain a cult following like Fortnite. Not every franchise is going to increase the player base year after year the way Call of Duty was doing for close to 10 years. But publishers push studios to be the next Call of Duty, the next Fortnite, the next Grand Theft Auto, with the goals of making as much money as those games. Hence the problems we have now with the ridiculous concepts that studios are bilking players for all of our money because the publishers are telling them this is how much money we need to get out of the game. You know, knowing studios are going to have to continue to do this and pull shit like this because publishers are basically pushing them to do so, it brings me back to my initial question again. But this time, I want to add a qualifier. If games were to sell at $70 as complete games, in other words, no cut content, no cut DLC, an actual complete product, would you buy the games? Or would you prefer to see games operate like Warframe and Fortnite, where the game itself is fucking free, but funding of the game comes from microtransactions? And this is the point of the video that Hatred would like to remind everyone that Warframe is still 100% free. He loves that fucking thing. Now, I honestly, I have no doubt in my mind, the next generation of console has to come with a price increase. There's just no way it's going to remain at $60. It's going to be bumped up to either 65, 70, possibly even 75. My concern is what happens after we pay the increased price in the future. The concern is what happens when publishers continue to set these unrealistic goals for their studios. I don't think this issue is going away anytime soon. As long as the money keeps driving publishers' decisions, we're most likely going to see both a game price increase and more microtransactions in every game. I know gamers would love to pay for a complete product. I know gamers would love a free product with optional purchases after the fact, but we have to realize that sometime down the road, it's probably not going to be possible anymore. Studios are losing money, publishers are stealing their money, and essentially everybody is out to get gamers' money simply because they know that there's not enough to go around these days. There are so many games on the market, saturating every corner with playable, online, multiplayer, PvE, PvP content. There are so many options for people to choose from that how do you get gamers to choose your particular game? That's going to be the challenge in the future, and why I think that most likely publishers are going to do both. However, if you had your choice, what would you choose? A more expensive but complete game, or free games with microtransactions? Anyways, that does it for this video. So as always, rate, comment, subscribe, and all the good shit, and I'll see you guys in the next video.